The morning Elias Cord was told he owned the largest cattle ranch in the Wyoming Territory, he was elbow-deep in manure, mucking out the last stall before breakfast. He did not look up right away. He finished what he was doing, set the rake against the wall, wiped his hands on his trousers, and only then turned to face the man in the black coat who had ridden 3 days from Cheyenne to find him. The lawyer, a thin, nervous fellow named Aldous Fry, was holding an envelope with both hands, as if afraid it might bite him. Behind Fry, in the wide doorway of the stable, stood 2 other men. They were not thin. They were not nervous. Their names were Preston Cord and Douglas Cord, and they were looking at Elias the way a man looks at something he is about to step on. "Read it again," Preston said. His voice was flat and dangerous. Fry swallowed. "I have read it twice already, Mr. Cord." "Then read it a 3rd time." But Fry did not read it a 3rd time, because the 3rd reading would not change what the first 2 had already made clear, that Harlan Cord, rancher, patriarch, and the closest thing Wyoming had to a king, had died 4 days ago and left every acre, every head of cattle, every water right, every dollar in the Rawlins Bank, and the deed to the house itself to a boy named Elias. Not his sons, not the church, not the territory, to the boy who had cleaned his horses for the last 11 years and slept in the room above the stable. If you want to know how a man's whole life can change in the time it takes to read a single page, stay with this story. And if you haven't yet joined this channel, do it now, because this is only the beginning. And what happens next inside that stable will shake you to your bones. Elias was 19 years old and had no last name he could claim with certainty. He had arrived at the Cord Ranch in the summer of 1871, 8 years old and alone, walking the road from Laramie with a busted boot and a face so dirty that the first woman who saw him thought he was a shadow. He did not know where his mother had gone. He knew his father only as a shape that came and went and eventually did not come back. He had survived the 2 days between Laramie and the Cord property on creek water and a handful of dried corn he had taken from a feed bag outside a mercantile. He had not thought of it as stealing. He had thought of it as continuing to exist. Harlan Cord had been in the corral when the boy walked up the road. He was a big man, wide in the shoulders and thick in the neck, with hands that looked like they had been carved from saddle leather. He had 3 sons at the time, Preston, 22, Douglas, 19, and young Cal, who was 10 and still carried some sweetness in him. Harlan had watched the boy shuffle up the road, stop at the gate, and stand there without asking for anything. "You hungry?" Harlan had said. The boy had not answered, but he had looked at the horses in the corral with something in his eyes that Harlan recognized. Not hunger, not desperation, something quieter, something that looked a great deal like love. "You know horses?" Still no answer, but the boy had slipped through the fence rail to walk straight to the most difficult animal on the property, a black gelding called Devil's Arithmetic that had thrown 3 riders and bitten a 4th, and stood close to his nose without flinching. The horse had snorted. The boy had breathed. And then after a long moment, Devil's Arithmetic had dropped his head and allowed the child to press his forehead against his own. Harlan Cord had watched that and said nothing for a while. Then, "You can sleep in the stable. I'll feed you. You work." That was the whole negotiation. That was the entire contract. And for 11 years, Elias had honored it without complaint. He had learned the horses the way some men learn scripture. Not just the names and the habits, but the moods and the silences. The way a horse holds its weight when something is wrong. The particular rhythm of breathing that means calm and the one that means fear. He could tell from across a paddock whether an animal was about to go lame. He could gentle a spooked mare in the time it took other men to find a rope. Harlan had watched him work and said little, but his watching was the kind that misses nothing. The Cord sons had other opinions. Preston, from the beginning, treated Elias the way he treated every hired hand, as furniture that occasionally needed to be reminded of its place. He never used violence. He did not need to. A certain tone of voice, a particular way of looking past a man rather than at him, was enough. Douglas was worse in a different way. He was intermittently kind, which created a cruelty all its own. He would sometimes speak to Elias as an equal, loan him a book, and ask his opinion on something, and then the next day looked through him as though he had never existed. It kept the boy perpetually off balance, never sure whether he was a person or a convenience. Young Cal was the exception. Cal had followed Elias around the stable from the time he was old enough to walk without supervision, and the two of them had grown up alongside each other in the way that children do when no one is paying attention. Honestly, without performance. Cal was the one who taught Elias to read, spreading the Cheyenne newspaper on a bale of hay and going letter by letter with a patience that shamed older men. Elias was the one who taught Cal that horses could sense dishonesty. They always know, Elias had told him once. Doesn't matter what you say, only matters what you mean. Cal had remembered that, and it would matter later. Harlan himself was a complicated man. He was not gentle by nature. The frontier had taken what softness he had been born with and replaced it with something harder and more durable. He was fair in the way that a demanding man can be fair. He did not ask more than he gave, and he gave considerably, but he was not warm. He did not explain himself. He made decisions and announced them, and the people around him adjusted. What he felt for Elias, he never said plainly, but there were things, small things, accumulated over years. The winter Elias turned 12, Harlan had appeared in the stable doorway during a blizzard to check that the boy had enough blankets. He had not spoken. He had simply looked, satisfied himself, and left. The spring Elias was 15, Harlan had spent 3 evenings teaching him to read a survey map, not because it was useful for stable work, simply because he had seen the boy studying one with confusion and had decided it was wrong for him not to understand it. When Elias had been sick with fever at 17, Harlan had sat outside the stable door for 2 nights, not going inside, not making a scene of it, but present. Preston had noticed none of this. Douglas had noticed and found it faintly amusing. Only Cal had understood what it meant, and he was wise enough to keep that understanding to himself. Harlan Cord had written his will in the winter of 1881, 6 months before the illness took him. He had done it quietly alone in the study where he kept his ledgers and his maps. He had signed it, sealed it, and sent it to Aldous Fry in Cheyenne with instructions not to open it until he was dead and not to discuss its contents with anyone before then. Fry had honored both conditions, though doing so had cost him several sleepless nights once he understood what was inside. When the old man finally died, quietly in his own bed in the early hours of a February morning, Fry had saddled up and ridden north into the Wyoming wind with a document that he suspected was going to cause considerable difficulty. He had not been wrong. The scene in the stable that morning was one that none of the men present would ever fully be able to describe, because it had the quality of certain experiences that are too large for words to hold correctly. Preston had gone very still. This was how he reacted to things that threatened him. Not with noise, but with a terrible, concentrated stillness, like a snake before it moves. Douglas had laughed once, a short and hollow sound, and then stopped laughing and stood with his jaw clenched. Fry was trying to be invisible, which was difficult given that he was the only one holding the document. Elias was looking at the floor of the stable. The straw, the dirt, the particular crack in the board nearest the second stall that he had been meaning to fix for 2 years. "This is not legal," Preston said finally. "It is entirely legal," Fry said. He had clearly rehearsed for this part. The will was drawn up properly, witnessed by 2 citizens of Rawlins County, and registered with the territorial office. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cord, but it stands." He was sick. He was not sick when he signed it. I can testify to that personally. He was manipulated. Preston turned to Elias, and now there was something in his eyes that was beyond anger, something colder and more permanent. "You manipulated him. You worked on him, year after year, playing the loyal dog, and you turned his mind against his own blood." Elias looked up then. He had a lean face, brown from years of outdoor work, with dark eyes that were slower to express emotion than his hands. His hands right now were very still. "I didn't know," he said. "Don't. I didn't know about the will. I didn't ask for it. I don't—" He stopped, looked at the envelope, looked at Preston. "I don't know what he meant by it." "What he meant," Douglas said, with a bitterness that was almost elegant, is that he loved you more than he loved us. And somehow that's supposed to be your problem and not his. The silence after that was considerable. Fry cleared his throat. There are practical matters to discuss. The ranch requires immediate— Get out, Preston said. Mr. Cord, I am speaking to him. He had not moved. You, get out of this stable. This is still my father's home. Actually, Fry said quietly, as of 4 days ago, it is Mr. Elias's home. Another silence. Longer this time. Elias picked up his rake, not from habit. He was aware enough to know it was not the moment for mucking out a stall, but he needed something in his hands. He held it the way a man holds something when he is trying not to fall. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not yet. Not until I understand it. Understanding it would take time that Elias did not feel he had. The ranch was vast, nearly 14,000 acres of Wyoming grassland, with grazing rights to an additional 6,000 that abutted the eastern edge of the Wind River Range. It ran 800 head of cattle, employed 11 cowboys, 2 cooks, a blacksmith, and a half-dozen seasonal hands who came up from Colorado every summer. There was a mortgage on the north pasture, a water dispute with a neighboring rancher named Gus Fenner that had been simmering for 3 years, and a contract with the Union Pacific to deliver 300 steers to the Rawlins rail yard before the end of April. Elias knew horses. He did not know any of this. What he had in the absence of knowledge, Waka, was something more fundamental. He was not afraid of work, and he was not afraid of silence. And in the weeks after the reading of the will, both of these qualities were tested considerably. Preston and Douglas left the main house within 3 days. Preston rode to Rawlins and hired a lawyer of his own, a man named Cavendish who had a reputation for finding inconsistencies in documents that other lawyers had considered airtight. Douglas went to Cheyenne and then farther to Denver, where he had friends and connections and apparently other plans. Neither of them spoke to Elias before they left. Preston looked at him once, on the morning of his departure, and the look said everything that the words had not. Cal stayed. Cal was 21 now, and he had grown into a quiet, careful man who bore little resemblance to the eager boy who had once spread newspapers on hay bales. He came to Elias on the 3rd evening after his brothers had gone and sat down on the fence rail beside the paddock and said nothing for a while. You should know, Cal said eventually, that I'm not here because I think it's fair. I know. I'm not sure it is fair. I don't know what my father was thinking. Neither do I. Cal nodded slowly. He was watching the horses move in the dark. But I know he wasn't confused, and I know he wasn't manipulated, so whatever he was thinking, it was his own. That counts for something. Elias was quiet. I'll help you, Cal said. With the ranch, with the books. I know more about the operation than Preston ever bothered to learn. Well, because Preston always assumed it would come to him automatically. He paused. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm not making a deal. I think my father knew what he was doing, and I think I'd like to find out what that was. This was how Elias Cord, for he would eventually take the name, reluctantly, after much thought, began to learn what he had inherited. The first test came from the land itself. April brought a cold that the old hands said they had not seen in 15 years. The cattle on the north pasture began to suffer, and 3 of them died before the cowboys understood what was happening. A sickness moving through the herd that required immediate quarantine and the kind of swift decision-making that could not wait for consultation. Elias made the call, on instinct and on what he had learned watching Harlan move through the world, and the cowboys who had served the ranch for a decade looked at him with careful, measuring eyes, and then did what he said. They did it, Elias understood later, not because they trusted him yet. They did it because Cal was standing at his shoulder, and Cal was Harlan Cord's blood. But they watched, and what they saw was a young man who did not pretend to know what he didn't know, who asked questions without embarrassment, who listened to the answers with the same focused attention he gave to a nervous horse, and who, when he finally acted without hesitation. By the end of April, the herd was recovering. The Union Pacific contract was fulfilled. The water dispute with Gus Fenner was resolved through a negotiation that Elias conducted by simply riding to Fenner's property, sitting down at his table, and asking him what he actually needed, which turned out to be access to a spring that Harlan had refused him out of stubbornness rather than necessity. Harlan could have settled this in an afternoon, Fenner said, shaking Elias's hand. Stubborn old fool. Yes, sir, Elias said. You're nothing like him. Elias was not sure whether this was a compliment. He decided to take it as one. The second test came from Preston. Cavendish, the Rawlins lawyer, had found what he believed was a usable inconsistency. A question about the witness signatures on the will, one of whom had died before Harlan, and whether the surviving witness's testimony alone was sufficient under territorial law. It was a technical argument, the kind that could spin itself into years of litigation, and Preston pursued it with the patience of a man who had never needed to be in a hurry because he had always assumed the future was already his. Elias received the legal notice on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for a long time. Cal read it and said it was serious but not fatal. Fry, summoned from Cheyenne again at considerable expense, said essentially the same thing but with more complicated language. The case could be won. It would cost money and time, and the kind of sustained attention that a man running a cattle operation in Wyoming territory did not easily have to spare. What do you want to do? Cal asked. Elias thought about it for 3 days. He rode the land during those days, all of it, the north pasture, the river bottom, the high ground near the tree line where the summer grass was just beginning to come in. He thought about Harlan Cord, who had looked at a dirty 8-year-old boy at a gate and seen something worth keeping. He thought about Preston's eyes on the morning of his departure. He thought about Douglas's voice saying, without quite meaning to, that their father had loved Elias more. On the 4th day, he rode to Rawlins. He did not go to Cavendish's office. He went to the hotel where Preston was staying and knocked on the door and waited. Preston answered in his shirt sleeves. He looked at Elias for a moment with that flat, dangerous stillness, and then stepped back and let him in. And they sat across from each other in a small room with a window looking out onto the main street of Rawlins, and Elias said what he had ridden 3 hours to say. I don't know why your father did it, he said. I have thought about it until I'm tired of thinking. I don't know if he meant it as a reward or a lesson or an apology for something I'm not aware of. I don't know if he thought it was just. I'm not sure it is just, but it's what he chose. Preston said nothing. I'm not going to fight you in court, Elias said, not because I'm afraid of it, because I think it would take everything he built and turn it into something that serves lawyers and takes 5 years to resolve. And at the end of it, whatever's left won't be worth having. He paused. I'm offering you the north pasture, the 6 sections north of the river. That's where your grandfather ran his first cattle. I know because Cal told me. I know what it means to your family. Preston was looking at him now in a different way, not with calculation, with something that might have been, in another man, the beginning of surprise. The deed would be in your name, Elias said. No conditions, no debt between us. You take the land and you drop the suit, and we don't have to see each other again if that's what you want. A long silence stretched between them. Outside, Rawlins moved through its ordinary Tuesday. A wagon, a horse, 2 women with market baskets, a dog. Why? Preston said. Because your father gave me something I didn't earn and couldn't have expected, and I'd rather use some of it to make peace than spend all of it making war. Preston looked out the window. His jaw was set. His hands on the table were very still. He loved you, Preston said finally. It came out with a difficulty that was painful to witness. More than he ever... He stopped, composed himself. More than was easy to see growing up next to it. Elias did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was perhaps the right answer. Preston took the north pasture. The suit was withdrawn. Douglas, when he heard about it in Denver, sent a brief letter to Cal saying he wanted no part of any of it and would be staying south. Cal read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in the drawer where Harlan had kept his survey maps. Elias found the letter there 3 years later, cleaning out the study. He read it once and put it back. What Elias made of the Cord Ranch in the years that followed was not a transformation. It was something quieter and harder to name. He did not become a different kind of man. He became more completely the kind of man he already was. He ran the operation with the same quality of attention he had given the horses. Patient, precise, responsive to what was actually there, rather than what he wished was there. He paid the cowboys fairly and listened to them when they spoke, and did not ask of them anything he was not willing to do himself. The water rights he secured, the mortgage he paid off, the cattle he bred up slowly, careful not to expand faster than the land could support. Cal stayed on as foreman, which was the right arrangement for both of them. Cal had the head for numbers and contracts. Elias had the feel for the land and the animals. Between them, they managed. Her people in Rawlins talked about the Cord Ranch the way people in small towns always talk about things that do not fit neatly into the available categories. There were those who said it was a disgrace. A man's sons passed over for a stable hand. There were those who said Harlan Cord had always been eccentric, and this was simply the final proof. There were a few, not many, but a few, who watched what Elias built in those years and said quietly that maybe the old man had known something the rest of them had not. On a late September evening in 1884, 3 years after the reading of the will, Elias was sitting on the fence of the main paddock, watching the horses move in the last of the daylight. Cal came and sat beside him, the way he had sat beside him the night his brothers left. "Preston's doing well," Cal said. "He heard he's running 200 head on the north sections now." "Good. He asked about you, in Rawlins. Asked how you were getting on." Elias watched the horses. Devil's arithmetic was still out there. Very old now, slower, but still carrying himself with a kind of dignity that age hadn't touched. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Cal said, "that you were getting on fine." They sat in the quiet of it. The sky over Wyoming was doing something extraordinary, the way it does in September. Going through colors that have no names in English, deep reds and silvers, and a particular shade of orange that only exists for about 4 minutes before the dark takes everything. "Why do you think he did it?" Cal asked. Not for the first time, but for the first time, Elias felt like he had something close to an answer. "And I think," Elias said slowly, "that he saw something in me that he recognized. And maybe it wasn't something he liked in himself. And maybe leaving me the ranch was his way of saying, 'This is what I should have been. Not who I was.'" He paused. "Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he was just an old man who loved a horse-crazy kid and wanted to do something about it." Cal thought about that. "Maybe both are true," Cal said. "Maybe," Elias said. Devil's arithmetic came to the fence then, slow and deliberate, and dropped his great old head over the rail. Elias reached up and pressed his palm to the horse's nose, the way he had done since he was 8 years old. Everything else, the land, the cattle, the deed in the Rawlins Bank, was the name he had taken with such reluctance and now carried with such quiet. All of it was real and all of it was his. But this was where it had started, with a horse that knew something the humans around it did not. That maybe the measure of a man has never been who his father was. Maybe it has always been what he is willing to become. There is something the frontier understood that we sometimes forget, that belonging cannot be inherited. Land can be inherited. Money can be inherited. A name can be inherited. But the right to belong somewhere, to be claimed by a place and to claim it in return, that has to be earned in a way that no document can record and no court can contest. Harlan Cord understood this. He had spent his whole life building something, and in his last months, he looked around at what he had built and asked himself one question. Who will carry this with the spirit it deserves? Not with the expectation of owning it, but with the love of someone who never thought they would. The answer was a boy who had walked up a road with a busted boot and no name, and looked at a horse with something that was not hunger, not desperation, but something older and rarer. Something that looked, if you were paying attention, a great deal like love. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something in the telling of it, then press like and let this channel know. And leave a comment below. What do you think Harlan Cord's real reason was? Was it love? Was it guilt? Was it his way of writing, in the only language he had left, the truth he could never say out loud while he was living? Tell us what you think. The best stories are the ones we carry forward together.